Imagine sharing a single room with 20 relatives, day and night. How did medieval families manage intimacy in such cramped conditions? This video dives into the fascinating and often overlooked aspects of medieval life, revealing the secrets they kept close. Asterisk, the smell hit you before the door even opened, an earthy mix of smoke, wet wool, old straw, and the faint tang of manure. Not an unpleasant smell, not if you've lived in it your whole life. It was the smell of warmth, of bodies pressed together in survival, of soup forever on the boil, of babies and grannies and chickens under one roof. This was not just home, it was life itself. In the year of our Lord 1327, in the hamlet of Wyble, nestled between two hills in the English countryside, a single-room home stood crookily beside a muddy lane. Its wattle and daub walls bulged outward like a bloated stomach, its thatched roof sloping unevenly under the weight of years and rain and bird nests. But inside, that one smoky room contained an entire world. There were 23 people who slept, worked, ate, birthed, died, argued, and whispered in that house. And most of them were family. Let us walk inside. The floor was packed earth, as dark as coffee and just as mottled. In some corners, old straw had been scattered, though it had long mixed with the droppings of geese and the crumbs of last week's barley loaf. A low fire crackled in a stone hearth set into one wall, where a large black pot of thick stew, mostly parsnip, occasionally rabbit bubbled quietly, sending tendrils of fragrant steam into the beams overhead. Smoke from the fire did not rise. Through a chimney, it billowed freely through the room, escaping slowly through a hole in the thatch, and clinging to every cloth and beard and hair it touched. The hearth was the center of the room and of life. Old Lysa, who was 80 if she was a day, sat closest to the fire, wrapped in a fraying woolen shawl, her gnarled hands knitting with thin, worn needles. She had borne 11 children, buried 6, and now watched her grandchildren's children clamber over one another in the soot. Her husband's old boots sat beside her, cracked and misshapen. He'd died a dozen winters ago, but she couldn't bear to throw them out. Behind her, 3 of her daughters-in-law peeled turnips and whispered about one of the neighbor girls, who'd run off with a tinker. 2 toddlers played at her feet with carved wooden animals, though one had lost its legs and now resembled a stump with ears. A boy of 12 was attempting to patch a hole in the roof with a thatch bundle. Teetering on a stool he shared with a nesting hen in the far corner of the room. Behind a hanging cloth that fluttered with every breeze, someone was giving birth. Yes, life. Happened here, all of it. Within these 4 walls, the architecture of closeness, there was no hallway, no corridor, no bedrooms or parlors. The entire house consisted of one long rectangle, divided mentally, not physically, into zones of function: hearth, bedding, storage, animals. Beds, such as they were, took the form of straw pallets, shared between as many as 5 people depending. On the night, the smallest children usually slept in a pile beside the fire, their legs tangled like roots. Parents slept with infants to keep them warm. Elders took the warmest corner. Teenagers, full of restless limbs and brewing impulses, were assigned whatever floor space remained in lofts. If the family was lucky enough to have a second level of planks above the beams grain sacks were stored, and sometimes older children slept up there, clambering onto hay bales like roosting cats. Privacy, in the modern sense, was a luxury for the wealthy and the mad. No one in Wyble expected it. Not really. Instead, life was partitioned by habit, by routine, and by an invisible choreography that came from years of cohabitation. When the father rose before dawn to begin milling, no one stirred. When the mother began washing rags in the basin, everyone subtly adjusted. When 2 lovers crept off behind the cart outside, the room pretended not to notice. Walls could be built of daub and clay, but the real walls were unspoken. Everyone under one roof. In the Truick household, bloodlines blurred. The house belonged to John Truick, a cooper by trade, who had inherited it from his father, who had added the animal stall to the eastern wall. John lived with his wife Beatrice and their 7 children, plus his mother Lysa, his 2 younger brothers, both unmarried and well into their 20s. His sister Agnes and her 3 children. Her husband died of fever last harvest. And a widowed uncle who mostly slept and drank cider. Then there were the animals. A cow, 2 goats, 4 chickens, and a half-blind cat shared the space. The animals were brought inside at night to prevent theft or wolves, and to keep the room warm in winter. The cow lowed in her sleep, the chickens clucked in their dreams, and once, during a particularly stormy evening, the goat gave birth in the middle of the common floor. And still, space was found. The secret was not in the size of the house, but in the flexibility of its inhabitants. A single bench might serve as a seat, a bed, a chopping surface, and a lectern for evening prayer. A chest held grain, linens, and, if you knew the trick, a stash of coins hidden under the false bottom. Every item had multiple lives. So did every person. There was no such thing as my corner or your seat. Territory was fluid, negotiated, daily, and defended mostly by tradition rather than ownership. When visitors came, and they often did, no one asked, "Where will they sleep?" Instead, a child was scooped into a sibling's arms, a pallet shifted, a goat moved. People flowed around one another like water. Somehow, it always worked. The unspoken intimacy to live this way was to know one another deeply. You heard your uncle's snores. You knew the sound of your cousin's laughter and the smell of your grandfather's cough. You recognized the cadence of your mother's breath as she prayed in the dark. You shared everything: lice, fever, secrets, stories, but you also learned discretion in strange ways. A couple might sneak a kiss behind a hanging cloak. A child might discover a parent's tears during the night and never speak of it. A teenage girl, blooming in a world with no locks and no doors, learned to create boundaries through silence, through posture, through subtle rituals of turning away. Intimacy was not erotic, it was inevitable. And yet, even in this crowded closeness, people found ways to protect sacred things. A relic of St. Cuthbert was kept in a small box above the hearth, opened only on holy days. A torn ribbon from a long-dead child's bonnet was folded into a crack in the beam. A love letter, scrawled on a strip of vellum, was tucked behind. A wooden slat, unread for years. Within the chaos, there was room for privacy, not of space, but of spirit. A space for everything else, in addition to people and animals. The house stored tools, seeds, sacks of grain, drying herbs, strings of onions, a broken spinning wheel, 2 cradles, one in use, one waiting, and a pair of worn candlesticks passed down from John's great-grandmother. Hanging from the rafters were bundles of lavender, sprigs of rosemary, a hunk of smoked ham, and the laundry from yesterday's rain. Everything had its place, or at least its moment. When a death occurred, the body was laid out in the same spot where the turnips were chopped. When a wedding was celebrated, it happened at the hearth. When a child was baptized, it was in the same wooden basin used for laundry. The house was not a home in the modern sense. It was a stage, and life was the play. Conclusion: the room that breathed at night. When the fire dimmed, and in a world with no privacy, every emotion became communal. If you were angry, the room felt it. If you were sad, it bent with you. If you loved someone truly, desperately loved them, it wasn't a secret kept behind doors or whispered through a crack in the wall. It was something you lived with daily in the same space where the stew boiled and your sister brushed her hair and your uncle sharpened his scythe. And if you hated someone, you still had to pass them the salt. That was the unshakable reality. In the Truick household of Widely Village, one room, 20 plus relatives, and a social dance more delicate than the king's own court. The mother tree, Beatrice Truig, had the look of someone who carried worlds in her eyes. She was only 39, but looked closer to 50. Her hands cracked from soap root in winter, her shoulders always slightly bent from years of carrying babies and firewood and grievances too small to name. She was not the matriarch. Old Lysa still breathed, still rolled in her shawl from her stool by the fire, but Beatrice was the trunk from which all family branches stretched. Every sibling confided in her. Every child ran to her. Every argument, no matter how old or fresh, found its way to her lap like a broken toy. It was Beatrice who navigated the small daily wars of living with 20 people. It was she who mediated when young Elias threw a coal at his cousin for stealing bread. She who stood between her husband John and his brother Thomas when their fight over who had rights to the pig pen grew loud enough to wake the baby. She who knew when to speak, when to hush, and when to pretend she hadn't heard a thing. Strength was not in command. It was an absorption. The arguments that never ended, arguments in a one-room house, didn't end. They simmered. There was no stomping off to another room, no slamming of doors. Anger had to be quiet, or it had to be shared. Sometimes it leaked into the stew. Sometimes it erupted in the open. A good example was the feud between Uncle Warwick and Agnes. Warwick, a grumbling widower with joints like rotten gate hinges, believed Agnes's children were freeloading. Agnes, whose husband had died 2 harvests ago, believed Warwick contributed nothing but gas and complaints. The two of them shared one end of the bench near the wall. They hadn't spoken in months, but neither would give up their seat. So they sat shoulder to shoulder every evening in silence, radiating ancient grudges like heat from a fire. When one coughed, the other sighed. When one muttered a prayer, the other muttered louder. The children learned quickly to avoid that corner. Even then, under the tension, there was a strange affection and understanding formed by years of shared grief. Shared soup, shared lice. Once, when Agnes fell ill with a fever, it was Warwick who soaked the rags and laid them on her brow. He never spoke of it again. Neither did she, because that's how family worked in a room with no walls. The children's kingdom. The children ruled by chaos, not logic. They didn't see the lack of privacy. They only saw an endless world of legs to crawl under, arms to cling to, and stories to chase. There were 12 children under the age of 15 in the Truig household. They slept like puppies and fought like roosters. They knew the creak in the floor near the hearth that gave away your midnight steps. They knew which parts of the thatch roof leaked and which beams you could climb if no one was watching. Children made up songs about the fleas. They told ghost stories about the latrine. They learned to read not from books. There were none, but from letters carved into the firewood or whispered into their ears. As lullabies. They also became experts in discretion. If their older cousin snuck outside to meet the blacksmith's apprentice, they didn't tattle. If their father wept softly after a failed crop, they didn't ask. The room taught them manners that no priest could preach. In such a crowded world, kindness became a survival skill. Secrets in plain sight. How do you keep a secret in a house with no walls? You don't single quotes T. Instead, you learn to carry secrets. You turn your head at the right moment. You pretend to be asleep when voices whisper too close. You offer the last piece of bread not because you're generous, but because you saw something and you want it forgotten. When Beatrice's eldest son, Simon, fell in love with the weaver's daughter, it was no surprise. Everyone saw the way he looked at her in church, how he combed his hair with more care, how he began volunteering to fetch water if it meant passing by the weaver's lane. But the moment that truly marked his heart when he first kissed the girl under the elder tree was witnessed by Agnes's youngest child, a girl of 6. She never told a soul. But from that day, Simon always made sure to save the last honey scrap for her. That was the exchange. Silence for sweetness, resentment, forgiveness, and rotting turnips. Resentment grows fast in small spaces. Sometimes it looked like a pile of laundry, left undone for days. Sometimes it sounded like a brother's teasing laughter that went one breath too far. Sometimes it was nothing but a bowl that hadn't been cleaned, and a spoon that had vanished in a house like Truick's. Everything mattered. Every gesture, every sigh, every missed chore, every extra bite taken from the stew. There was no room for selfishness. But selfishness still happened because people are people. And when it did, the air shifted, voices sharpened, petty slights turned to real grievances. Once, someone hid a rotting turnip under the bedding just to make a point. It was discovered 3 days later, and no one confessed. But for weeks after, the art of intimacy in a shared space in a medieval home filled with 20 people's siblings, cousins, uncles, in-laws, goats. Intimacy was not about touch or sex or whispered promises under the moon. It was a choreography of glances, a timing of movement, a subtle agreement that said, I see you, even if I can't look at you right now. For the Truicks of Weidle, intimacy wasn't stolen behind doors. There were no doors. It was grown quietly between the folds of everyday life, tucked behind a hanging cloth, beneath the hush of candlelight, or in the rhythm of a shared task done in silence. It was a language developed not with words, but with presence. And for those brave enough to love each other in such a place, it took equal parts courage, patience, and craft. Learning to want in silence, Simon Truick was 17, tall, quiet. His hands had just grown into man's hands, and his voice had cracked into that awkward space between boyhood and baritone. He worked hard, said little, but he watched everything, especially her. Her name was Alice. She was the daughter of the village weaver, and her laughter sounded like apple cider bubbling in a barrel. She had a crooked smile and walked like someone used to dodging chickens. She was not beautiful in the courtly way. She was real raw-faced from wind, with dirt always under her nails from helping her mother with a loom. And Simon adored her. But how do you fall in love when your brother sleeps 2 feet away, your uncle snores like thunder, and your sister is always asking you to fetch water? Very quietly, the rules of desire in a house with no privacy, people developed strange habits to preserve intimacy. Eye contact became more potent than a kiss. A hand brushing another's while kneading dough was a thrill. The act of walking someone to the well, even with 3 children tagging along, was considered practically scandalous. To be alone together was a rare and delicate miracle. Simon would sometimes linger too long on his chores, just in case Alice came walking by with her basket of dyed wool. They exchanged barely 5 words in total over months, but their glances held libraries of meaning. One afternoon, while helping his younger sister hang laundry behind the house, Alice appeared with a bundle of cloth and stood just close enough for their hands to meet under the sheet. Their fingers touched. That was it. But that night, Simon lay awake on his straw mat, heart racing, the sound of chickens muffled beneath the weight of a single glorious brush of skin. Intimacy was often less about what happened, and more about what could, Dean single quotes, T. Married love. Medieval style Beatrice and John had been married for nearly 20 years. In that time, they had conceived 7 children, buried 1, weathered 3 winters without grain, and shared roughly 1,000 quarrels over firewood, in-laws, and goats. And yet, they loved each other fiercely. They didn't say it. Not aloud. There was no time, no space, no purpose in saying things that were already known. But the intimacy between them hummed like a quiet song through every motion. When John returned from the fields with aching limbs and cracked lips, Beatrice pressed a warm cup into his hands before he asked, When Beatrice spent a whole day grinding grain and coaxing the children through fever, John stayed awake to rub the knots from her shoulders before she lay down. Their lovemaking, when it happened, was an act of logistics and luck. There was no marital bed, only a pallet shared by at least one toddler, a teenager who refused to sleep elsewhere, and a dog. So when the rare window of privacy opened during a village feast, or when the children were away herding goats, it was like slipping through a secret door into another life. And when that happened, it wasn't frantic or loud. It was reverent, tender. Afterward, they'd simply smile. Then, without a word, return to the clamor of the house, their shared secret glowing between them like the last coal in a dying fire. The curtain of courtesy some homes, like the Truicks, had a trick for carving out brief moments of seclusion. A curtain dot, it wasn't thick. It didn't block sound. But it meant something. Usually just a woolen cloth suspended between two beams or hung from a rope. It divided the space into here and there. And when someone drew the curtain, it was understood. This moment is not for you. That it might mean someone was changing, or breastfeeding, or crying, or simply trying to rest without being stared at by 11 eyes and a chicken. Everyone respected the curtain, not because it was law, but because it was survival. Behind that fabric, people whispered confessions, tended to blisters, shared secrets, nursed grief. It was the medieval equivalent of a locked door, and it was sacred. Hidden touches and forbidden love, of course. Not all intimacy was sanctioned. There were stolen glances between cousins, quiet kisses between apprentices and masters, daughters. In villages where everyone was related or soon to be, the lines of propriety blurred. One girl in Widla once disappeared for a day and returned with her hair undone and her silence louder than words. She refused to say where she'd been. Her mother wept, her father stormed, but the girl simply returned to her chores. Later that month, she left to serve in the manor, quietly sent away. Everyone knew what had happened. No one said it, but when a young man stopped showing up at Sunday Mass, they drew their own conclusions. In tight quarters, secrets never stayed buried. But shame didn't always follow. Sometimes understanding did. Intimacy beyond the body, the deepest form of intimacy in such a world, was not physical. It was witnessing. Knowing someone so completely that you could finish their sentence or stop them from saying it. Being the first to notice a limp, a cough, a bruise. Sensing a bad dream before it fully arrived. Old Lysa, who had lost more than she remembered, used to hold Beatrice's hand when the younger woman felt overwhelmed. No words passed between them, but that wrinkled, calloused hand carried lifetimes of pain and comfort. It was enough. Sometimes 2 people in the house would sit side by side for hours, saying nothing, simply sharing breath beyond the walls, finding private moments, in a home where even the mice had to share corners. True privacy didn't come with shutting a door, it came from leaving the house entirely. There, beyond the boundaries of wattle and daub, where the hearth smoke thinned into the sky, lay the only spaces where a medieval soul could truly hear its own thoughts. Behind a hedgerow, in the woods at dusk, by the river at dawn, or sometimes halfway up a hillside with a jug of milk, watching clouds drift like monks in procession. For the villagers of Widla, including the crowded Truick family, finding private moments wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. And those moments often define the shape of their inner lives. Dawn's first gift before the rest of the household stirred. Simon Truick would slip out the wooden door with a loaf crust in one hand and a basket in the other. His task was simple. Gather eggs from the hens in the lower pasture and check on the goat tethered near the old yew tree. But it wasn't about eggs. It was about air. Outside. The world was cooler, quieter. The sounds were crisper. Dew clung to the grass like blessings, and the wind told secrets that walls could never keep. For 15 precious minutes, Simon walked alone through the mist. No shouting cousins, no clattering pots. No uncles muttering about pigs. Just him. And the soft cluck of a sleepy hen. It was during one of these walks, 2 years earlier, that Simon had first composed a verse in his head about clouds, about longing. He never wrote it down, never said it aloud, but it lived there in the silence. Between trees. Because sometimes the most sacred conversations happen with no one at all. The privy. More than a place to sit, it might sound absurd to modern ears. But for many, the privy, the outhouse, the pit latrine, the little wooden shed behind the cabbage patch, was the only space that offered solitude. Yes, it smelled. Yes, it was cold, but it had a door, a real one, with a latch. For a mother overwhelmed by children, for a father fed up with squabbling brothers, even for a teen trying to avoid relentless chores. A few stolen minutes in the privy could feel like a pilgrimage. Beatrice once told Agnes that the privy was the only place she could pray aloud without being interrupted. Christ heard me louder when my skirt was up than when my knees were down. She joked. And perhaps he did. Forest trysts and hedgerow confessions for lovers, especially young ones, true. Intimacy often required slipping away from the village. Entirely, the hedgerows became hiding spots. The orchard, a chapel. The woods, a confessional. When Simon finally kissed Alice, the weaver's daughter, it was not under moonlight or in a flower-filled meadow. It was in the shade of a sheep pen, while pretending to chase a runaway lamb. They laughed. Then their laughter died into silence. And then just briefly, their lips met. It lasted all of 3 seconds. They heard footsteps, pulled away. But the moment burned longer than any candle ever could. That kiss would never have survived. Inside the house, not under the gaze of 9 relatives and 2 chickens. It needed space. And the world outside, unpredictable and wild as it was, offered that in fleeting slivers. Work as escape, strangely enough. Labor was often most effective path to solitude. When Beatrice needed time to think, really think, not just react, she took up tasks that kept her slightly away from the house, gathering firewood, picking herbs, walking to the stream to scrub linens. She did these not just because they were necessary, but because they provided space. Space to remember her mother's voice, to question why her eldest daughter no longer smiled at supper, to mourn privately the baby she had lost 2 winters before and never named aloud. Once, while collecting nettles behind the church wall, she wept, not loudly, not long, but enough. And no one saw. And that in itself was a kind of grace. Sacred spaces in nature. Every member of the Truick family had somewhere they went. Old Lysa, despite her bent back and aching legs, still hobbled once a week to the stone wall near the sheep fields. She said she liked the way the sun hit the stones there. In truth, it was where her husband had first asked for her hand awkwardly, stuttering, with a bramble in his hair. She went there not to remember him, but to remember herself as she had been when she said yes. John Truick, strong and practical, would sometimes pause in the barn after chores, leaning on the rake handle, staring at the rafters. No one interrupted him, not even the children. They sensed it. Those moments of pause weren't weakness. They were his soul exhaling. Even the youngest children had secret places, hollows under trees, a favorite flat rock beside the stream, a gap between haystacks. Places to think or imagine or sulk in a world where most of your life was shared. Finding even a pocket of solitude could feel like owning your own kingdom. Pilgrimages of the heart sometimes. Privacy came in the form of leaving entirely. Pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual act, it was a social and emotional reset. Even if one didn't reach Canterbury or Santiago, Even a week's journey to a nearby shrine offered relief from the weight of constant closeness. Agnes, after her husband's death, took such a journey, left her children with Beatrice, walked with a group of women to a chapel 3 valleys away, said medieval intimacy, a window to the past centuries have passed since the last fire burned in the hearth of the Truick home. The beams that once held the weight of children and smoked hams have long since crumbled into earth. The thatch is gone, the daub washed away by rains that forgot the stories whispered beneath them. And yet, the intimacy born in that single crowded room still echoes, not in buildings, not in relics, but in us. Because to understand medieval intimacy is not just to peer through the dusty panes of time. It's to find ourselves, our fears, our longings, our laughter reflected in the dim light of a world where nothing was private, but everything was personal. Echoes in the dust, imagine for a moment, stepping into the ruins of that one-room home in Widley. It's early morning. Mist hugs the ground. You pass under the arch of what used to be a door. No hinges remain, only memory. You see nothing but grass and stones. No blankets, no fire, no voices. And yet, at hums. This was the place where grandmother sang lullabies older than the church, where a young boy wrote poems in his mind because no ink could be spared, where a husband once kissed his wife's hand not out of romance, but because she was shaking from grief and he didn't have the words. This was intimacy not carved into stone, but soaked into the soil. Invisible, but never gone. The architecture of touch. When modern minds think of intimacy, they often imagine grand gestures, roses, letters, dramatic embraces, and candlelight. But the intimacy of the medieval world was not theatrical. It was utilitarian, raw, quiet. A shared bowl of broth after a hard day's labor. A back rubbed beside a fire as someone coughed through the night. A glance across a smoky room that said, "I know you're hurting. I'm here." The medieval world did not permit extravagance, but it made space for closeness through necessity. You had to share warmth. You had to share food. You had to take care of each other, not because of sentiment, but because not doing so could mean death. And so, every kindness became sacred. Every touch meant something. The legacy of living close to the Truicks, like so many families of their time, didn't write histories. They left no portraits, no monuments, but their lives still shape the landscape of emotion we walk through. Today, they taught us how to be close, how to forgive quickly because you'll be sleeping beside the person you argued with. How to find meaning in small things, a bowl passed without asking, a blanket folded just right, a story told for the 100th time because a child asked. How to see someone fully, not just as a relative or a spouse or a burden, but as a human being trying to find a corner to call their own in a world with no corners. Modern walls separate. But back then, life's proximity gave way to a kind of emotional literacy that few today ever master. What we lost when we gained space, we built bigger houses. We created bedrooms, offices, guest wings. We gained privacy and with it, peace. But in some ways, we lost something too. We lost the ability to read one another through silence. We lost the deep patience required to endure others' moods, smells, stories, and needs. We lost the kind of intimacy born from inconvenience when you must care because not caring isn't an option. In the Truick home, you didn't choose to be present. You simply were, constantly, and in that presence grew a bond deeper than most romances ever touch. We moderns, with our headphones and screens and locked doors, sometimes find it hard to even sit with one another, but our ancestors in homes of mud and wood lived inside each other's lives, and somehow, in the noise, they found the quiet center of connection, a story within the silence. There is one story, passed down through the oral tradition of Widley that survived long after The village was swallowed by the forest. It was of a winter so bitter, the river froze from bank to bank. The Truick family, already 21 strong, took in another, a beggar woman with no name and a newborn, found collapsed by the hedge. They gave her space, a place by the fire, a share of their bread. For weeks she barely spoke, but she sang, every night just before sleep. She would hum a melody none of them knew, wordless, haunting, soft as snow falling in darkness. One night, when the storm howled outside and everyone was curled tight for warmth, Beatrice's eyes open, mind restless, whispered, "What's the song from?" The woman replied simply, "It's from when I still had a home." No one asked more, but the next night, Beatrice hummed it with her. Then Simon, then Lisa, until the whole house became a chorus. Their breath one voice, echoing a grief they didn't need explained. That song, nameless, forgotten, became the lullaby of that house for years, because sometimes intimacy isn't about knowing someone's story. It's about holding it with them, looking through their window. To look into the lives of the medieval poor is to see ourselves stripped bare. No polished manners, no curated personas, just people, deeply enmeshed, caring, failing, forgiving, arguing in the morning and passing each other's stew in the evening, stealing a kiss behind the haystack, and still having to help wash each other's shirts the next day, saying nothing for hours, yet understanding more than 1,000 texts could ever express. It's tempting to pity them, their lack of comfort, of space, of control, but perhaps in the ruins of their world, we glimpse something precious that we've let go of. The knowledge that to truly know someone, you must live with them, not just in address, but in rhythm, in struggle, in breath. How still lives today, we build houses with dozens of rooms. We avoid noise, we avoid mess. So now you've walked through their world. You've stepped into the one-room homes where every breath was shared, where silence was rare and love was never locked behind a door. You've seen how 20 people lived as one body, breathing together, grieving together, loving in fragments, and surviving through rituals not written in books but carved into daily life. In a world without space, they found closeness. In a time without privacy, they found grace. And in the hardest moments, through famine, loss, storms, and toil, they found each other. Perhaps what we call simple was anything, but perhaps in their cramped little lives, they held something. We've forgotten that the deepest intimacy is not found in seclusion, but in presence. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet ones. A bowl of stew shared without being asked, a hand held in darkness. A glance across a crowded room that says, "I see you." I'm still here. In those one-room homes, they didn't choose closeness. It was their reality. But maybe, just maybe, it made them more human than we've ever dared to be. So tonight, when you turn off the lights and lie down in your quiet room, remember them. The Truicks, the forgotten families of medieval Europe. Not nobles, not kings, but people ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath. And remember this. Sometimes the smallest homes hold the biggest stories. Sometimes the poorest families leave the richest legacies. And sometimes true intimacy isn't about being alone. It's about never being alone at all. Good night, and thank you for walking with them.